humour. So we're here today talking about the future of the automobile and the fascinating learning experience for me as well as for the rest of the auditorium here. So we're joined today to discuss the future by Kingsmill Bond, analyst, New Energy Trusted Sources, Jim Fontanelli, senior analyst at RITI, and Cyrus Mewawala, director of research at CM Research. Now, the format that we've agreed for this afternoon's session is a 10-minute or so presentation from each of the guys giving their views on the future of the automobile, and then some discussion thereafter. The broad shape of the three papers is going to be context from Kingsmill, themes from Jim, and stocks from Cyrus. So there we go. So let's start off then perhaps with the context and Kingsmill.
Brilliant, thank you. So my name is Kingsmill Bond from Trusted Sources, and I want to talk about today five things, I guess, actually. First of all, I just want to set out what I think is going on in the global car markets and its significance. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the history of energy transitions. Thirdly, I want to talk about battery prices, which is a key element what's going on. Then I want to talk about China, and finally I'll talk about oil, and I will do all of that, I think, within 10 minutes if I try hard enough. So, what I think is going on here is a transition from petrol cars to electric vehicles, which will, in retrospect, be as obvious as the transition from the horse to the petrol car was a century ago. It's a remorseless and inevitable transition, and I think it will happen quite quickly. And it will change many things in the world around us. So that, I believe, is the context. Vis-a-vis history, I just want to make 4 or 5 points which are not necessarily widely accepted. So one argument that's often made is that it's very hard to do an energy transition. But if you look at even the most cursory glance at history, you'll see that energy transitions happen all the time. And if I take one example of lighting, probably LEDs. I hope they're LEDs. Anyway, so lighting 2 centuries ago was candles, then it was whale oil, then it was kerosene, then it was coal gas, then it was electricity, and now it's LEDs. And each of these transitions required vast amounts of capital and massive changes, and on each occasion, people who lived through whatever the prevailing form of lighting was at the time felt that it wouldn't change, it'd be too much hassle, but each time it did change. So it's normal to have change. The second point I'll make is this is not the first coming of the electric vehicle. In 1900, the electric vehicle was actually the dominant car technology, accounting for 42% of cars in the United States, apparently. 40% were steam-powered, 42% were electric, and the rest were another technology, petrol cars, which turned out to be successful. So it's interesting to ask yourself, why were petrol cars more successful than electric cars a century ago? And the answer actually boils down to 2 things. First of all, there was no electricity infrastructure to speak of 100 years ago. And of course there is an electricity infrastructure right now. And then the other thing was that batteries a century ago were prone to breaking and relatively expensive. Again, that's also changing. So the 2 reasons, I believe the 2 core reasons why the electric vehicle failed a century ago are now being solved. And then I think the final point I want to make by way of introduction on history is that rising powers, and I'm talking about geopolitics here, rising powers ride new technologies to global hegemony. So it was that this rather small, damp, cake-eating island, to quote Emma Thompson, rose to global preeminence 200 years ago by exploiting coal and steam engine. And so was the United States, rose to build preeminence by exploiting oil and petrol engine. And I believe that now it will be China's turn, using electric vehicles and renewables to rise to global preeminence with these technologies. So there's a very good reason, therefore, for China to be using this stuff. Okay, that's enough on history. I want to talk here briefly about 3 or 4 other points. We're going to look at battery technology. So batteries are the core technology, obviously, in the electric vehicle. The price, you need basically about between 20 and 60 kilowatt hours of battery capacity in a car to give it a decent range. And 5 years ago, it was $1,000 per kilowatt hour. So you can see, the time was 60 or 80 actually kilowatt hours. You needed a $60,000, $80,000 battery was required in an electric vehicle 5 years ago. The price of the battery has been falling extremely rapidly. It's now around $350 per kilowatt hour. The industry reckons they can get it to about $200 by the end of this decade. Elon Musk thinks $100. But anyway, the point simply is that it's falling. So if you do the maths, if you need, let's say, a 50 kilowatt hour battery and the price is $200, you're now talking about $10,000 engine, not a $100,000 engine. At that point, it becomes comparable with a petrol car without subsidy. So the point then is that we're very close to a transition point in terms of costs. And then the final point to make on batteries is that people often try and think about petrol versus electric within the context of their own experience, not unreasonably. So we think about how we travel and drive in the United Kingdom or in the US, but actually, with all due respect, that doesn't matter. It's not about us. It's about China and India. And in China and India, they drive an awful lot less. And consequently, they don't need batteries which are nearly so large, and consequently, the transition point will be much faster and at a much higher price per kilowatt hour. In fact, I believe the transition point has already come in China. Anyway, we'll come on to that. Okay, now moving on to China. It's not necessarily widely appreciated, but China actually already leads the world in the use of electric vehicles. There are 2 specific electric vehicles where China has an absolutely dominant position. The first is the bicycle. So, no, you don't laugh. There are today, I think there are more electric bikes here. There are more electric bikes than there are cars in China. And each one of those electric bikes is reducing the amount of journeys that people are taking by car. Anyway, the point is there are 230 million electric bikes in the world and 200 million are in China. And last year sales of electric bikes in China were 35 million bicycles, more than everywhere else in the whole world. There's another electric vehicle technology where China's just taken the lead, which is the electric bus, where we haven't got completely accurate stats, but anyway, basically 124,000 commercial vehicles in China, most of which I believe are probably electric buses at the end of 2015, dwarfs anywhere else in the world. BYD think by 2025, all the world's buses will be electric, all the world's new buses. So there are 2 areas actually where China already leads the world. And electric cars, last year, again, it depends which stats you take, but basically in electric cars, the United States was stagnant last year. China tripled their electric car sales to 190,000 and is on course to be the largest electric car market probably by the end of this year. And I think if electric bikes and electric buses are going to go by, they will dwarf the rest of the world by the end of the decade. Anyway, and finally on China, there's a very, very good reason why the electric vehicle will succeed in China, and it's geopolitics. China just overtook the US. China overtook the US being the world's largest oil importer some time ago. If you look at the IEA forecast for Chinese oil imports, by 2020 they're meant to be importing 80% of their oil, primarily for use in transportation. That's going through Malacca Straits, controlled by the US, completely unacceptable, I would assume, for Chinese policymakers. So they don't want to defend me things in the audience there, but nevertheless, I think it's a very important geostrategic point to make. Secondly, you have pollution. Thirdly, you have this point about hegemony, this is technology of the future. And then finally, and it's also a relevant point, you have the leapfrog point, which is that the world's premier auto manufacturers are all Western in the wider sense of the world. Chinese don't really figure. We don't really hear by BYD or Geely cars. But if you want to leapfrog to dominance, then actually you probably want to leapfrog to dominance with this new technology. Okay, I think I've got another 2 minutes, one minute maybe. So I want to talk about oil, which I guess is where I started looking at this issue from. The reason why the electric vehicle matters to many of us in this room, all of us perhaps in this room, is because of oil prices and oil demand. So to be clear, 64% of oil is used in transportation, 33% of oil is used for cars. Most projected oil demand growth over the next 20 years comes from more vehicles, I should say, in emerging markets. So it's hugely significant, this. Electric vehicles today, there's 1 million electric vehicles in the world, and they're using the equivalent of about 50,000 barrels of oil, less than actually, 50,000 barrels of oil a day. So it looks as if it's a very long way from having an impact. Global oil demand is about 93 million barrels of oil a day. It's growing at about 1 million barrels of oil a day per annum. So you need to get to, let's say, 500,000 barrels of oil a day to have an impact on global demand. So the math's pretty simple. We're at 1 million electric vehicles today. You need to get to about 20 million electric vehicles. And at that point, you'll be taking away 500,000 barrels of oil a day. You probably won't be very far away from 40 million, at which point you actually have destroyed all incremental global oil demand. So the question simply, and maybe I'm hoping there's a good lead on to my two fellow panelists, which is, the question is, when do we get to 20? And you can read various pieces of research. It's a market which is growing at about 70% a year. So as you can imagine, growing that fast, it doesn't take very long to get from 1 to 20. It could be 2020, it could be 2025, it's almost certainly going to be before 2030. But my final point then is that I think within the decade of the 2020s, we will see this transition from petrol-based cars to electric-based cars take place, and that will have very significant repercussions. So I should stop there. And over to Jim.
Thank you, Kingsman. So afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jim Fontanelli. I work at Arete Research as a semiconductor analyst. We don't cover autos directly, but the changes underway in that industry are increasingly impacting the companies we cover, certainly in the broader tech spectrum. So I'm happy to be here talking about some of those trends. Certainly from the viewpoint of a semiconductor analyst, it's been a fascinating last 2 to 3 years to see how the humble car has become a key focus market for many of the large tech companies globally, both at a hardware and a software level. Certainly the tech influence being funneled into the auto space from some of the biggest tech companies is clear. Just over the last 3 years, Apple and Alphabet have almost doubled their cumulative R&D spend from $9 billion to $17 billion, with the car as one of the strategic areas of spend. And this has had a ripple effect through the entire autos industry. And I think from a macro level, it's obvious why this focus is there. Apple and Google between them have got revenues of $300 billion. And there are not many industries that could significantly move the needle for these guys. In 2015, autos plus after sales was a $3.5 trillion industry. And as importantly, it's at an intersect of some potentially quite radical change. Firstly, how consumers view the car, essentially the move from a combustion engine to a platform fully connected with and responding to the external environment. And then secondly, how the car is viewed as a utility for mobility service that it provides. And then third, how well established the network is, both at a supplier and a manufacturer level, and at a transport infrastructure level. It has to adapt to deal with the first two forces. So looking at some of the autos headlines over the past week, I think has reinforced these three elements of change. We saw GM a couple of days ago spend $1 billion to acquire a 3-year-old software company called Cruise Automation that develops standalone software for self-driving cars. And that's after GM acquired or invested in Lyft and Sidecar last year, which were both ride-sharing companies. We saw the first accident of a self-driving car on public roads with a Lexus using Google Autonomous Tech. We saw the UK allow a driverless lorry pilot scheme to start this year. We've seen numerous big OEMs, Citroën most recently, commit to the autonomous future The recent Geneva and Detroit motor shows, everybody was there highlighting their autonomous credentials. And then we've seen, obviously, the Dieselgate scandal from VW underline just how much regulatory pressure is now coming to bear on the big car companies from an emissions and also a safety perspective. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to think a little bit about the first two of those trends. Firstly, the car as a connected platform. So if you think of three concentric circles with the auto OEMs sitting in the middle, trying to push out into the digital ecosystem, then you've got a second circle, which is, I think, the software-led hardware players pushing into traditional auto space, which is essentially greenfield OEMs. So obvious examples are Tesla or Faraday potentially, but there are hundreds of potential EV-based startups looking for funding, and maybe even you get players like Apple directly entering the auto market at some point. And then you've got the third ring, which is basically pure software and services. Guys such as Google, Baidu, or Tencent, who are all looking for a way to access further customer data. The problem, though, is complexity and cost. The car is already a highly complex and robust system. It's got an average of, an average mid-range car has got 100 million lines of code sitting inside it. And to put that in context, Facebook needs 60 million lines of code to run its business. A leading-edge, fighter jet needs 25 million lines of code. The car as an ecosystem is incredibly complex already. And then when you start adding into that a highly complex suite of sensors, which are going to be necessary to make a car either semi-autonomous or fully autonomous. So camera-based sensors sitting alongside high-frequency radar, LiDAR, ultrasonic tech, a processor fast enough and a software clever enough to mesh all of that data together in real time and then figure out where potential threats are and what to do about them. And just, as an aside, the whole Google, the Google fleet, they've got, broadly 60 cars running around California mainly. The sensor pod sitting on top of a Google car is an $80K piece of tech. So this is not a day-to-day price point. These cars are still hitting the road with a very, very high SP, reflective of the incredibly complex tech that's sitting inside them at the moment. And then on top of that, if you start layering in vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure communication, which you need to, if you're contemplating an autonomous world, then an already complex system takes an exponential step up. And then into that, you've got to layer a significantly increased set of security protocols as the points of access to the car increase dramatically. We've already seen multiple hacker-related stories appear in the press over the last 12 months. So this is why we see quite a significant gap between the hype around autonomous car and just how quickly they become available to the public. We think it's far more likely that the car, the 90 million or so that are sold each year, will continue to see a slow adoption of level 2 and level 3 semi-autonomous tech, whether it's automatic braking or adaptive cruise control, lane keeping. So this would still provide, I think, plenty of tech opportunity. Certainly from a semiconductor perspective, that's true. The move to semi-autonomous alone would provide an opportunity just in sensor tech of $450 a car. And when you think the average car today has about $350 of semiconductor content all in, it's a pretty significant revenue opportunity that sits out there. But even some of the adoption of that relatively basic semi-autonomous tech, like automatic braking, will have significant safety benefits, which is one of the reasons governments particularly are pushing for an end goal of autonomous and fully autonomous. There's been some recent work done by the Department of Transport, which shows that a few $100s in additional in-car safety systems, like automatic braking, which is essentially level 2 on the automation scale. If level 4 is fully autonomous, levels 2 and 3 are semi-autonomous. You could address 80% of the accidents for about 20% of the cost of fully autonomous. So whilst we're sceptical of any time frame for the wide-scale adoption of the autonomous car, which isn't going to be measured in decades, we see the evolution of our second theme, which is the car as a utility, a mobility service, as a way of speeding the niche adoption of autonomous tech, and indeed EV, I think. And a few stats to set the background on that. In the US, the number of 16 to 24-year-olds holding a driving license has fallen from 76% in 2000 to 70% in 2014. Car sharing services and car sharing members in the US and Germany have risen by 30% a year for the last 5 years. And in the UK last year, average vehicle ownership rose 2% nationally, but declined 5% in London. So if you take what looks to be a growing trend towards shared mobility and layer that into the fact that the car is a horrendously underutilized asset. In the US, the average car spends 96% of its time parked, and of the remaining 4%, 0.8 is spent looking for parking and 0.5 sitting in congestion. So you're effectively driving your car for 2.6% of the time it's parked and drive. You can see the opportunity for change in traditional car ownership models. And indeed, pretty much all of the major car OEMs have set up internal divisions focused on the shared ownership model. A good example in London certainly is BMW's Drive Now service, which launched in 2014, where with an app you can see where the nearest car is, book it immediately, drive it, leave it parked up wherever you find a public parking space, and the next person comes along and drives it and leaves it somewhere else. Easy. This segmenting up of demand by the car makers then, I think, becomes much less about what it has been historically, which is basically being country or region based, and becomes much more about city, suburb, and rural as your segmentation, as your demand segmentation. So if you look at high-income population-dense cities like New York, London, Singapore, for example, they represent about 300 million people globally. Would there be a market for fleet service to a segment of this population, where you have a range of cars offered depending on your need, whether it's family, commute, early morning drive, and you pick between them depending on what you need at any given point in time. Equally, in low-income population-dense cities like Mumbai or Buenos Aires, would a fleet of robust, basic EV-based vehicles alleviate congestion and pollution? I think clearly they would. I think there are plenty of business models which are now getting worked through, where the higher cost of autonomous or EV could be defrayed over a far higher usage, and where the cost of additional infrastructure can be spread over many more users. So we think that it's the speed of proliferation of these urban sharing services that represents the real opportunity for autonomous EV over the next decade. But from the perspective of a 90 million a year unit car industry, autonomous EV, we think, at least will remain comfortably a sub 10% segment for the next decade. So anything involving the auto industry generally takes years to play out anyway, we know that. The development time for a new 7 Series, for example, is 7 years. Then that platform is going to get manufactured over forward 5 or 8 years typically. So well over a decade in development and sales. From a hardware perspective, cycle times are far longer, certainly than versus consumer tech, which is partly why we see the recent hype around autonomous as far too optimistic. And look at EV penetration. Clearly, it's consistently disappointed, at least historically, in terms of unit sales. So this long cycle duration is why we like the auto-focused semi-players, such as NXP or Infineon, for example. A good visibility, structurally increased semi-content over time, and a very consolidated set of players. So with that, I will hand over to Cyrus.
Thanks, Jim. My name is Cyrus Mabelwala. I'm head of research at CM Research. CM Research does thematic research in tech, media, and telecoms globally. So Kingsmill talked about context. Jim has talked about themes. I'm going to talk about stocks. But in order to, and these are the stocks that I think over the next 5 years will benefit from this autonomous vehicle theme. And in order to do this, I'm going to focus on 4 technology themes that intersect between technology and the autos sector. And along the way, I'll mention some stocks. So these 4 themes are artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, connectivity of the car, and infotainment systems within the car. So information and entertainment systems within the car. So kicking off with artificial intelligence then. And by AI in this context, I mean the intelligence we need to drive the autonomous car. So first, in terms of timing, Kingsmill hinted that the first fully autonomous cars will be commercially available by about 2020. Now, McKinsey reckons that by 2030, about 15% of all cars sold will be fully autonomous. But we don't have fully autonomous cars on the roads yet because of regulation. What we have instead is an interim measure called ADAS, or Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. And that's what Tesla, for example, uses in its autopilot. The leader in fully autonomous vehicles, if we take a 5 to 10 year view, without doubt is Google. And Baidu in China is pretty close behind. But that, as I said, doesn't exist yet on the roads. What we do have is ADAS, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. And the leader there, in my view, is Mobileye, which is an Israeli chip company. But there's a company called Citroen Research which has a cell report out on Mobileye, and its shares are diving. They're partly diving because it's also valued at 30 times next year's sales. Now, even for a tech company, that's a pretty high valuation, but you can see where this is going. So Mobileye chips are in 23 out of 25 of the top 23 out of the top 25 automakers. So it's got a leading position. Companies which want to follow this lead are NVIDIA and Ambarella. And then in China, of course, there's Baidu, which is developing its own robot car. And there's also a small company called AI Driving, which is private, which is China's equivalent of Mobileye, but less developed. And then, of course, the traditional parts makers, the auto parts makers, they also claim to have their own ADAS systems, and that is Continental, Bosch, Delphi, and so on. The second theme within AI is big data. So cars will generate gigabytes and gigabytes of data every hour that they drive. And this M2M data, machine-to-machine data, which is from video data, from sensor data, and from all other types of mapping data, it needs to be captured and it needs to be analyzed. And one of the leaders today in analyzing machine-to-machine data is a company called Splunk, and that's valued pretty highly as well, even in the tech world. But this area of real-time analytics for machine-to-machine data is an area that every software company is entering into. So you're going to see a lot of competition in this area over the next couple of years. And that's because it's not just the autonomous car that requires machine-to-machine data analysis, but it's the whole concept of the Internet of Things, of which the autonomous car is just one field. The other fields are ambient commerce, so you walk into a supermarket, you get offers, the automated home, med tech, wearable technology, and the industrial internet. You know, monitoring things like a Rolls-Royce engine on a Boeing 747 when it's in the air. The next area of technology that intersects with the auto sector is the cloud. So all of this data I've been talking about sits on the cloud. Most of the analysis of the data takes place in the cloud. So cloud infrastructure companies will, in effect, be the operating system for the Internet of Things, or the operating system for the next generation of cars. Now, the leaders here in cloud infrastructure services are Amazon Web Services. It's got 30% global market share in cloud infrastructure. And close behind them, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and IBM SoftLayer. And HP Enterprise, which is just split off from HP, is also moving heavily into this area. And the one thing I'd say about the cloud is investors are grossly underestimating how important cloud infrastructure is. So on a 2 to 3 year basis, I'd see all these companies doing much better than analysts predict at the moment. And part of the reason for that is cloud infrastructure. Then we move on to operating systems. So right now, the primary operating system in a car is still controlled by the car maker, Audi, BMW, Daimler, and so on. Although a lot of it is outsourced to their parts, their suppliers, who actually make the software that runs it. Tesla, for example, uses a version of Linux, which is open source software that's specially adapted for the Tesla operating system that drives that car. Apple and Google, which we normally associate with operating systems, are confined at the moment to infotainment systems, so just the entertainment systems within the car. But in the future, when a fully autonomous car arrives, the operating system will be where much of the value migrates to. So there's a massive race to dominate this area of software. The tech companies like Apple, Google, and Baidu on the one hand, and the car companies on the other. And the stakes are incredibly high, as they always are, when software invades an expensive hardware sector. Next area within AI is mapping software. Now, it's no coincidence that Google is in the lead in terms of robot cars, and it's also got the best mapping software on the planet. Apple has maps as well, but they're nowhere near technically as good as Google. HERE, which is a mapping division of Nokia, has just been bought last year by the 3 German automakers, Audi, Daimler, and BMW. And the only mapping software that's still independent is TomTom. So you can see what's probably going to happen in the next couple of years. Car makers are going to rush to buy stocks like TomTom. Because without mapping software, it's very difficult to lead in the next generation of cars. And the final technology within AI that I want to talk about is augmented reality. So what's the difference between VR and AR? Well, virtual reality creates an entirely artificial world. Often you black it out by using a headset. And augmented reality blends virtual reality with real life by superimposing artificial objects in a user's line of sight. So if I'm driving my Tesla, I can focus on looking at the road while I have a kind of holographic screen in front of me that tells me what's happening behind me, tells me what speed I'm going to, and tells me if I want to call someone on my mobile phone. So the leaders in AR at the moment are Google, Microsoft, which makes HoloLens, and a small company or a private company called Magic Leap. The leaders in VR at the moment are Facebook with Oculus Rift, Sony, HTC, and Samsung. But as far as the autonomous car goes, AR is more important than VR. And that's where I want to end. Thanks very much. So just a few themes of where cars cross with tech.
Great. Cyrus, thanks very much indeed. I haven't seen pens moving as quickly as I did just in that last section, as people trying to write down the names of those companies, especially the smaller ones. But anyway, fascinating themes. Look guys, we've got about 10 minutes or so to have some discussion here on the panel and open it up as well to the audience to get involved. I've learned a lot already. Let me bring a question from my own background, I suppose, from macro background. We have a macro environment that is challenging, to say the least. The sound of helicopters revving up to drop cash on markets already awash with fleets of QE money, still nothing particularly working there. We've got growth engines, economic growth engines, which at best are stuttering, to put it politely. We've got, as a consequence of that, 30-odd buck oil. Some people from this morning's panels were talking about $20 in prospect. So that combination, is it the best challenging for most things? Is it the right environment to encourage necessary investment in electric vehicles and battery technology to bring down that point of entry? Anybody? Or doesn't it matter?
Let me give a stab at this. I think that rather than using helicopter money, we should be building we should use it back capital to build an entirely renewable system, an electric vehicle system, and it would be a much better use of the world's capital and talents than otherwise. And it could actually, it's big enough numbers actually to kickstart growth and make very significant change.
But just for the moment, imagining that the helicopter pilots don't have the automobile industry in their heads-up display for the drop zone, what about that background? Is it necessary? Are the conditions right? And I might also throw in the fact that corporate profitability is also seeming to be rolling over. Corporate buybacks have been pumping the market, the equity markets for the last several years. Those engines may go into reverse. Is this the environment where companies actively go in to make the investment necessary for the autonomous electric vehicle, or does everybody sit back and say, let's have a free ride on oil, on low oil, and carry on with the petrol engine?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that. I mean, I think there are a couple of trends sitting behind that, which the car companies, and the broader autonomous software, hardware infrastructure have no control over. One is regulatory. Clearly, the focus of building fleets by Daimler and GM, Ford, etc., is not just based around where they think consumers are going to put their money. It's based around where they need to meet regulatory fleet emission standards, both in Europe and the US. And so there's no choice here, right? They have to meet those fleet regulatory emissions, and to do that, part of their fleet clearly needs to be EV. Otherwise, they have no chance of meeting the emission targets set by the EU or the US, unless they cheat, on a 2020 or 2025 basis. So, on one level, there's no choice. The investment in EVs will clearly continue regardless of where the price of oil is. The second perspective is that, certainly from a battery investment viewpoint, cars is only part of the market, and arguably a small part of the market. If you're looking at the addressable market for lithium-ion or broader battery types, then the renewables market and the energy infrastructure market is a significantly larger opportunity for batteries at the right price points. And this is a lead into the debate around renewables and the penetration of solar and wind, and the degree to which the generation of intermittent energy requires stable storage, which is something we haven't had to date, at least not at economic price points, but which I think is coming in the next 5 years, certainly in the next 5 to 10 years, and then that moves battery adoption, battery tech, and battery price points to a whole different level than just whatever we have sitting behind our EV unit curve.
My response would be that the macroeconomic environment we have today is almost irrelevant, because the tech companies are totally focused on expanding their ecosystems. How they make money, whether they're Apple with hardware or Google with internet advertising, is by expanding their ecosystem. Right now they own your home, they own the office, and the next place they're going to own is the car. Plus, a lot of them have billions of dollars of cash sitting on their balance sheets doing nothing. They're looking 5 to 10 years ahead. So today's macro environment is also pretty much irrelevant.
Great. Okay, roll up. I'm down to the Tesla garage myself. Open it up to the audience, and I've got a question right up at the back, and then here as well. Have we got a wandering mic? We do have a wandering microphone, battery-driven. Tim.
Tim Parker, Messels. I'd be fascinated on your comments on graphene and its implications for the industry.
So would we.
Was that directed at anybody in particular, Tim?
Well, graphene only impinges very slightly on my consciousness as a semi-analyst. I mean, that's potentially a future material. It's one of the materials being considered for sub 3 nanometer semiconductor manufacturing, but we're at least 15 years away from having to make a decision about what constitutes commodity material for semis manufacturing. Whether graphene has direct relevance to batteries, I think if you look at the number of startup battery companies out there, there are any number of materials combinations that are being put forward, of which graphene is one. But every combinatorial chemist and his mate has a battery startup these days, looking at different combinations to meet different price points, and different delivery demands within the market. Graphene might be one of those.
Any other thoughts on graphene? Great, thank you for that. And we've got a question here.
You mentioned that car driving habits are very different in emerging markets, but is that just because car ownership is much lower and the infrastructure around roads is much poorer, or so you don't expect to kind of, or do you think it's structurally different, or just later in the curve?
No, I think it's because the Americans are uniquely profligate in their use of energy.
And the rest of us approved. Anybody else? I've got a question there, yeah, and I've got another one here, I think.
I'd like to come back to the battery technology side of it, and just to sort of hear Al's views on, because there's an array of potential battery technologies with different characteristics, different price points. I'd be interested to hear the view of the panel about broadly which technology they think is going to win and why in this space.
Well, maybe I'll take it. I mean, I think very obviously it's going to be lithium-ion, right? As a starting point, it clearly has to be. There's the volume there. You have the price point drive from the car manufacturing industry, where lithium-ion is de facto standard, and it meets a bunch of other criteria such as first responder safety. So you don't have any of the issues of rolling up to a basement in an industrial warehouse and having to look for some volatile set of chemical combinations exploding on you. So it meets a bunch of very obvious initial criteria for getting a technology or a new set of demands met. Beyond that, I think it's, I think we're still in very early stages. If you look at most of the large utilities, both in Europe and the US, they are all piloting large-scale commercial battery storage schemes with at least two or three different types of underlying technology in there. So, I think we'll probably figure out which the right tech is for which segment, over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, when we're talking about battery storage into the electrical grid, you're talking about very long investment curves. So I think lithium-ion will fill a niche initially because the capacity is there and because the price point is there. But I don't think necessarily that's where we're going to be in 10 years' time.
Okay. Sorry?
I pretty much agree with that, and it's the basis on which Tesla and Panasonic are building that massive factory in the US. But 10 years ago, everybody was talking about fuel cells and hydrogen cars, and on many levels, those thoughts have just vanished now. And it does look like electric cars based on lithium-ion batteries are what most people are going to opt for now.
Has the question gone away? The mic, okay, fine. Any other questions from the auditorium? Gentleman up here.
How long does it take to charge one of these batteries?
Sorry, can you repeat that again? How much?
I mean, currently, I guess you have to plug the car into the main for hours to charge the battery. So what sort of charging times would you envisage?
Oh, okay, charging times on battery technologies is a limiting factor?
Yeah, they'll come down significantly, right? It depends how much you want to spend in your garage to get quick charge. But the technology is available today to get a full battery charge inside 2 or 3 hours. It just depends how much you want to spend on the infrastructure sitting behind your purchase of your Tesla car or whatever EV you may have sitting in the garage.
And what sort of drive range would you get from this?
Sorry, couldn't hear.
And what sort of drive range would you get out of this? 2 or 3 hours charge?
Well, it's a 3-hour full charge, so whatever full drive range is, of the platform. I mean, right now we're, I guess, between 250, 300 miles for full EV, for full luxury EV segments, and anywhere between 50 and 100 miles for the economy segment of the EV market. But that, those ranges will increase as battery efficiency increases.
It also depends if you have manufacturer charging equipment in your house or whether you use the normal electric plug. So with a normal electric plug, you might plug it in overnight. With Tesla's own charging kit, it might be a couple of hours.
I know this at a parochial level. I visited my local Tesla store recently, only to look. And they were very happily impressing me and my teenage son with their network of owned charging stations, equivalent to petrol stations, all across the UK, specifically within 200 miles of each other, and proudly boasting a network which extended to Budapest that would allow me to drive one of their vehicles all the way to Budapest in under a week, using their own network of things. So a changing pace, but already some utility value in their own technologies.
Actually, sorry, just
Yeah.
another one. What people are finding is that most charging takes place at home or at work, and consequently, there's many hours to do so. So it's a bit like a mobile phone, you just come home, you plug it in, that's it. So I think it's an issue which exists more in the mind than in reality.
It's possible, we have the technology. And I think we've got one more question here. Yes, over here.
Can I have 2 questions? Is that okay?
Very good.
So I've just got 2 questions. The first is just around this the penetration story, and the comment was made that the carpool does change very slowly, or has historically changed very slowly. And we're sort of juxtaposing that against this fairly rapid, or this very exciting new technology. And I'm just trying to kind of understand exactly where we net out really in that story. And I guess Kingsmill's point, I think, was actually we don't need to see that much penetration in order for it to be to have an impact on other things like oil and so on. So that's just a question, really, is that right? And then the second question is around semis and autonomous vehicles and this idea that we will use them as a utility rather than something as sort of as a status symbol. It's more just a utility. So we'll have fewer cars. And so again, you've got a sort of net story there. You've probably got declining, perhaps, volumes. Have you in that sort of scenario? But do you have still increasing content per vehicle, which means that it's still a happy story for the semi businesses? So there are just sort of two questions, but both around where do we sort of net out with these, at some points, sort of conflicting trends?
So a sort of tipping point for EVs and overall volumes.
So got the first one. I've always wanted to say this in a public forum. The person who invented the statement, "History is bunk," was of course Henry Ford. And it's an exceptionally appropriate moment, therefore, to say you can't necessarily rely on history or one interpretation of history. But actually, that said, I mean, just do the maths yourself. If you're growing at 70, if you're trying to get to 20 million electric vehicles to have an impact, and you're at 1 today, and you're growing at 70%, it doesn't take that long to get there. Maybe, I mean, the debate really is whether or not that growth will slow from 70 to 30 or something, and therefore it takes a little bit longer, quite a lot longer actually. But I think you can reconcile actually Jim's point about it taking a very long time for the whole system to change, and my point that it can be quite quick for a sufficient number of electric vehicles to materialise to have an impact on oil prices. So actually, both of those, I believe, can be reconciled against each other.
Can I just take the semis question very quickly, sir? At the moment, the average car has about $400 of semiconductors in it, and the average smartphone just has $60. And obviously in the car, that amount is going to rise as we move towards fully autonomous vehicles. But even though, as you rightly mentioned, it's possible that the number of cars sold may fall because of car sharing and cab services, there are a whole bunch of ancillary industries that will benefit those semiconductor companies. So drones, for example, Amazon could be using thousands of drones all over the world. They will use similar chips and similar technologies, and also the whole robotics industry is being transformed partly by the car industry. So historically you needed good robots, you needed industrial robots to make good cars, but now with the technology that we're putting into autonomous cars, that technology is being transferred to robots. So navigational technology, for example, mapping technology, which means that robots will come out of factories where they're normally in cages because they might chop your hand off if you're in the right place, and they'll come into your home and in your office. You'll have robots to care for people. You'll have robots to hoover your house. You'll have robots to mow your lawn and so on. So all these chips will be used in these ancillary services.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think the car makers are up against they're up against between a rock and a hard place insofar as car selling prices haven't moved for the last 15 years. If you adjust real terms, and so the car makers know that broadly someone buying a BMW 5 Series is spending broadly 50 grand, and that's where the level is. And so if you're going to start offering significantly more tech sitting inside the car, then you have to find savings elsewhere, which they've historically been doing, right? The car makers have historically found 3 to 4% efficiency per year to offset the increasing tech content and the increasing semi-content sitting inside the cars. And so the balance has been, maintained, and the ASP that the consumer expects has been maintained. I think, if you start to look at the impact of services on car ownership and how the business models change around car ownership, then I think you can make the case that you can see a significant increase in tech content, in semis content, sitting inside the car as a platform, which then doesn't get passed on to one owner. It gets defrayed across multiple owners because the car companies are having to build a car to deal with a whole different set of demands. They're having to build a car that doesn't sit for 90 6% of its time on a driveway, it maybe sits for 30% of its time, in an underground car park, and the rest of the time it's getting used because utilisation rates are so much higher because you've got a shared ownership model. And so the car needs to be significantly more robust, it needs to be much more durable in terms of dealing with significantly higher kilometres per year. And so you get the content benefit from that coming through, both in electronic systems, but also in the broader platform. So I think you can comfortably make a case that you'll see an offset to declining unit numbers in far higher semi-content per car. And to put that in context, EVs, pure EV has about $1,100 worth of semi-content, most of which sits in the powertrain, versus $350 to $400 now for a typical combustion car. So you do see quite an offset in revenue opportunity, even if unit numbers decline slightly.
So guys, great. Fascinating. Just before we wrap, because it's coffee now, a one-phrase answer, please. The sort of thing every analyst, including myself, hates, but I'll invite you to it anyway. Fabulous presentations from each of you, big picture stuff, the intersection between auto manufacturers and technology, directions of travel, is one of the striking themes that I'm going to take away with that. In terms of the winners in this game, one phrase answer, are the winners the car makers or the tech companies? Each one.
For selling cars, the car makers. For providing services, tech companies. And I think they will be differentiated.
That was two. Kingsman?
Tech companies.
Tech companies. Cyrus?
Tech companies.
3-1 tech companies. Okay. Gentlemen, thank you for a fascinating review and insights into the automobile, the changing face of the automobile industry. That's the end of my Jeremy Clarkson interval. And I think coffee backwards. Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you.